Hello, all of you out there watching on OLC Live. I'm Ben Scragg, one of the conference co-chairs for Innovate 2019. I have with me our keynote speaker, Manoush Manoush, cheers.
Oh, cheers.
We get to do this because this is what we're doing.
Drinking and streaming.
It's
the name of our new show, Ben.
It's pretty on brand for me. So I don't know where it is for you, but anybody who knows me,
you're ahead of me.
No one is surprised. So nor will they be surprised by the relative level of inarticulation to follow on my part. So
I will try to up the game.
Well, let's see what we can do. I want to jump right in with you and maybe start, kind of start in the most recent place and work our way back. So you just finished season 3 of Zigzag, and you kind of explored the hype cycle and talked kind of about this idea that we're in some ways, well, actually, I'm gonna jump ahead or jump back to kind of Bored and Brilliant. So we will start at the beginning, where you talked about kind of we're doing experiments on ourselves in some sense relative to our attention. Or Bored and Brilliant was certainly that. So I want to have you kind of put you in a scenario and ask you to think about some experiments you might run on yourself. And if you are a college freshman starting today, you're back in college.
God help me.
But maybe a lot of our audience works kind of in the online space. So think about not necessarily the campus experience or what the on-ground experience was, but just kind of from the intellectual perspective, or even thinking about what you've learned kind of about life online. Are there experiments you might run kind of with your own learning?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the things I talked about in my talk was that I hear from a lot of teachers and professors, and that's from, pre-K on through higher ed, that they are having to make sure that the kids or young adults in their classes are doing kind of the more human tasks, right? That they're making space where the laptops are put away and people are looking at each other and sharing ideas and thinking about what the other people say. Obviously if kids are young, it's teaching people to say, like, I liked how you said that. It makes me think of X, right? How do you have a conversation? These are things that teachers now have to teach. When I was a kid, you just had conversations.
That's right.
So I guess I would say, what opportunities are there for people who are learning online to meet in Meet World, as we like to call it, in real life? Can they make sure that there are real life situations where they can test out their ideas or have conversations where they don't feel pressure to put an idea into a perfect email or a perfect post? And where, as Sherry Turkle, MIT psychologist, would say, they can have the uncomfortableness that comes when someone's trying to tell you something that they haven't quite worked out, because that's when you get to know someone. And when you give them feedback, when you say, keep going, yes, that's when your brain starts to go, it gets tickled, you keep going, and that's when you break, hopefully, new ground. So I think we're at this point where we certainly see the benefits of online learning, no doubt, but we can't leave behind the very human things that also can supplement that and increase the efficacy of it.
So thanks for that. And it makes me think about my curiosity for you and your own learning. So you, in the last year, have jumped into this whole new facets of your life in a bunch of areas. Have you started, or have you always been conscious of kind of how you are learning, or have you started to clue into kind of any of the metacognition around like how you have approached diving into the things you've kind of dived into, whether it was cryptocurrency or looking at hype cycles? Like, have you, or even other projects, have you started to think about, or do you get a chance to think about how you learn and how you approach that?
It's weird to me because I did not think of myself as a particularly intellectual or curious person until relatively late in life. And I think it's when I started learning again in situations. So story is what makes sense. Became a journalist. Stories help me learn, right? So if I understand why someone built something or what they wanted to understand, so they came up with that formula, I need to understand their motivation. I need to understand how they got there, how they felt when they got there, and then where they wanted to go. So I think it took me a long time to understand that that narrative is crucial to me understanding. And so I think you're referring to the sort of deep dive that I did last year into blockchain and crypto, which really was like sitting down and like learning a language that not many people speak. It was incredibly intense. How did I learn about it? I wrote a song about it. I had to explain it to other people. Only when I explain it to other people can I truly process it. That's me. And everyone's different though, right?
Yeah. So the other thing I saw was also the positionality you took, like in your life, to start a business, and then the stakes on that have been very real for you too. And so I wonder, has that played a part in terms of, it's interesting to hear you say like, oh, I didn't know how long I've been curious in my life, or I've got curious late in life, but have the stakes of things made that more real for you?
Well, I'll speak specifically to becoming a media entrepreneur, and specifically in the last year, I was part of this rather unusual experiment in using blockchain technology. We won't go into the specifics, but I think as a journalist, we're really good, particularly us tech journalists, are really good at throwing stones and like having criticism. Having skin in the game made me have to understand the sweat, blood, and tears that go into building something from the ground up. And I have an increased respect for really how much focus and dedication it takes to build something new. That makes me a better journalist, hands down.
And I see a model for that in really good teaching and learning too, that challenges students to really produce something that, if you're my instructor, the flow isn't just you give me an assignment, I give it back to you, you grade it, and that's great, I did well or I didn't, but we're having authentic, real learning where students are maybe being asked to make a contribution or something's happening there. So,
well, and you know what? I think you just put your finger on the reason why maybe I didn't feel that invested or curious or all those things. It was this passive flow of education for me as a kid in the 80s and 90s. Whereas, I learned that I love learning when I am part of something. And now, of course, people are much more you in your field are much more aware of different learning styles and different ways of, getting people involved. I have to touch things. I have to look people in the eye. That's how I learn.
So I think you and I, it's fair to say, I think at this point we're really good friends, so I can offer you some constructive criticism in your life.
Okay,
and it's mostly that you're probably not busy enough. I'm not sure that you're living an ambitious enough life.
Oh yes, you're right.
But one of the things you did or have been doing is the IRL podcast with Mozilla. And you did an episode in January.
Which one are you
that there's one on January 21st on content moderation. It caused me to lose some sleep.
It was very upsetting.
And so one of the lines in there from one of the folks that was interviewed who had essentially kind of been hired as a content moderator
in the Philippines.
Yes. They were continually kind of exposed to the worst of the worst on the web, maybe the worst of humanity in terms of graphic images, repeatedly. And they said, I am different from what I am before. It's just like a virus in me. And they were talking about the way their brain had changed from continual exposure to that. And I'm thinking about, let's lower the waterline on the intensity of kind of exposure to those images. But do you see a connection to the rest of us and what's happening to us and the web, even if it's not kind of violent images? But you've written about this, I think, in Bored and Brilliant. Do you see kind of a gradation of what's happening to us and how we ought to be thinking about that kind of vis-a-vis technology or what we're exposed to on the web?
I am not a neuroscientist. I'm not a cognitive psychologist, but I interview a lot of them. And here's the good news and the bad news. The brain's plasticity is extraordinary. And that can be wonderful. If you want to learn something new, you can do it. And there are little life hacks you can make that will help you learn it. For example, taking notes by hand actually encodes the information into your brain better than typing it out. We're learning a lot about how the brain works. On the flip side, as you say, seeing horrendous images, anybody who's experienced trauma knows how that physically manifests itself. And seeing it online is no different. And well, it's different but no less destructive for people. It's very interesting. I think we are at a point where we know how things affect individuals. We know how they affect communities, maybe even societies, but we're at this moment where things are affecting people on a global scale. And we don't know how billions of people being affected something then behave and act and change the world. Whew, have a drink on that one, man.
Tell you what,
like, wow.
I can see that. I'm going to offer myself some criticism. We got to bring this back up. But here's the thing about your work is like, bring it back up is still something that's like Ryan Straight, Dr. Ryan Straight over there, who's kind of managing our Twitter feed, asked me to ask you about this, and then it wound up in your talk today. So it's still problematic. You talked about this idea of like being an infomatic. He talked about it as information guilt, just this idea of like, there's so much stuff you want to get to, and you're just never gonna. So either you sit open with 1,000 tabs, or you create a pocket list, which I really appreciate you sharing that. Do you have a strategy for yourself, because you're inundated with stuff, around how, one, you don't get this kind of information guilt, or how you deal with like your pocket lists?
Pocket and I have a very tumultuous relationship. At first I thought, for those of you who are not users of Pocket, it is an app where you can collect articles that you want to read. It formats them beautifully so it looks clean and easy to read, and you can tag them, all sorts of things. It was bought by Firefox, Mozilla, who's an ethical tech company, so I feel pretty good about using it. On the other hand, I shove at least 20 articles a day in there. I subscribe to stupid numbers of newsletters. And there are days, like for example, traveling here, I had time to look through them. And I was like, but I have to be smart. I'm like, what am I looking for? You know what I mean? I'm coming to OLC. I'm going to speak to these people. I want to be able to tell them if actually something has happened regarding tech regulation. I want to be like, and you know what happened today? So that was my goal today. But what I really try to do, and I think this is crucial, is to set my, it's so dorky, to set my information goal before I dive in. What am I looking for? Am I looking to figure out what we're going to do for my daughter's birthday? Then do that. Don't get sucked into the rabbit hole that is like Japan Village and all the cool things that right? No, stop. Am I preparing for a show? Then do that. And so setting the goal keeps me on track, because otherwise, oh my God, I could just read the internet all day long.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. That probably makes you kind of a more active reader than kind of scanning for what you're looking for.
Well, there are periods though where I will say, I'm going to read these 3 articles.
Oh, you make a choice.
And sometimes I will print them out and put my pajamas on and get into bed with a pen and just do it, and read and revel in the words and enjoy it. And other times it's more like this, and then my head kind of hurts, but I kind of get buzzed as well, right? Reading is a joy.
So time check for you. I have 2 more questions. You have time for 2?
Yeah, look at this. I have wine left.
Okay,
that's good.
That's terrific. So I'm going to pull one in from the audience. This comes from my wife Marissa, who's out there and has been listening to Zigzag and wants to know about when you're in the phase of the trough of disillusionment. So from season 3 of Zigzag, we're talking about the hype cycle. The trough of disillusionment, as it sounds, is kind of the low point in creating something new. There's lots of doubt, etc. But also a time where you can learn, adjust, improve. So for anyone who's feeling like they're in a trough, how can they start working their way through it, out of it? Where's the silver lining when you're in kind of that trough of disillusionment? And for our audience, I would say, I think there's a connection for a lot of times when we start to think about either the bureaucracy of administering programs, or when we're inside a course with students, we feel those moments too. So
where you're like, what am I doing this for? Oh yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that, because my co-founder and my producer, Jen, said to me yesterday, she said, you know, doing season 3 about the hype cycle and sort of the blueprint that there is for an idea to go through makes me realize it's not me. I am not alone ever. And so being here at OLC makes me think, like, if you're in the trough, someone else is in the trough. And guess what? you have access to them. There's a community here. And if you're like, I think one listener was like, I am troughing. I was like, oh, that's good. Is that an adjective?
Yeah, it will be.
So like there's other people troughing.
Yep.
And here's the good news. It's temporary. Sometimes it lasts longer than others, but I'm guessing those of you in this world are staying in it because you know that you get out of it. And when you hit the slope of enlightenment, which is the next phase, it is so sweet and keeps you going, right? And up you go again until you do it again.
Yeah.
It's a roller coaster. You're on it. But there's usually people out there to hold hands with and scream, I would think, within the OLC community. And I think that's why you have it, right?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think my story that I'm thinking about and probably share a little bit tomorrow is about what's most valuable in this space to me has been community and the relationships that I've built and the friendships that I've built. So last thing, April 11th, Zigzag Season 4 coming out. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What to expect?
Oh my God, you
what
want
the highlights
sneak
are?
preview?
Yeah.
Okay. It's a big change, actually.
Okay.
We're switching things up. It's been a narrative structure. We've been telling the story of founding our business, all these things. We are going forward into looking at how people are redefining success. Okay, what does that even mean? We are looking at the culture of business, what needs to change, and what I think is very much a new movement towards a more collective spirit, towards a more sustainable spirit. I think there are investors out there who want more than to make 100x in returns. I think there are technologists who want to do more than scale. They actually want to put good into the world, and that might be smaller than we've had expectations. There are, and this, I don't know, I'm curious to hear how this speaks to your line of work. But I think there are people who are like, I don't need to be a unicorn. I want to build something that supports me and my family and that I feel good about. And so we are talking to people from pro surfers, women who have used to not have pro surfing, who are like, I do this, I am a professional, and there will be money, people like that. We're talking to a group called Zebras Unite, who have been really good about creating communities in various cities across the country. I encourage you to get in touch with them about finding new investment vehicles, people who want to fund things that are simply smaller, sustainable, slow growth. We're in a moment where we see like growth hacking and scaling and all that stuff. Oh my God, it's raw chaos. We can't keep going like this. So we've got to call it. We got to find better and new ways. And I think there needs to be kindness involved in all of that. How does that speak to you as an educator who is tasked with reaching as many people as possible?
That's such a great question. And I think the trend toward, particularly in digital spaces with education, kind of the call to humanize learning. So everything, there's typically a big push for scale, a big push for efficiency. And I think there are a lot of folks who look at like, what's the heart of what education is? What does it mean? And a lot of it's grounded in relationships. A lot of it's grounded in community. Personally, I mean, I love the idea of lifelong learning, but I'm not always such a fan of grounding that within a particular learner as an individual, knowing that we're in community. We need help. We need each other. We learn socially. And so I think those calls for transforming, not maybe necessarily just the business model, but how we teach and learn in ways that kind of bring people together collectively is really powerful. And I think the technology, for all the ways that it's terrifying, it's not equally distributed. There's power and there's economics that we need to work through. Like the power of these tools to bring us together is kind of that piece. Tressie McMillan Cottom was with us yesterday, and she talked about pragmatic hope. And so I think, I think we can recognize a lot of the complicating and problematic factors that we have to work through. And that's not just a easily brushed aside thing.
No.
But yeah,
what if we reset our expectations and we say it's going to take a while, it's going to have to be cross-disciplinary, it's going to be slow growth, and we're okay with that.
And I think for as long as we claim our agency to those things, then there's potential. So yeah.
Jimmy.
Yes, and one of these for the road. Manoush, thank you so much. It's been a treat having you. So folks out there,
great
thank you.
questions. Thank you. This was fun.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, y'all.